afternoon, everyone. I'm Athana Malik, the rapporteur for today's seminar lecture, which is themed Global Events and Local Narratives, 9/11 and Folk Artists of Bengal. I welcome you all, and most importantly, I welcome the speaker for today's event, Dr. Roma Chatterjee, who is a visiting ICCR chair and a member of Department of Sociology of Delhi School of Economics. There has been a significant amount of discussion on globalization and the counter forces vis-a-vis indigenous, local and vernacular. And it is to the credit of Professor Chatterjee who has contributed heavily in our understanding of folk art and culture. She has offered us complete examples of multi-site ethnography, and her works bring together visual anthropology, conventional visual anthropology, conventional craft of ethnography, and contemporary issues. Apart from her incredible interest in folklore, she has also worked on collective violence and medical sociology. Her publications include Writing Identities, Folklore and Performing Arts of Guerrilla, Living with Violence, an Anthropology of Events and Everyday Life, and her latest book, Speaking with Pictures, Folk Art and the Narrative Tradition in India, is a path-breaking exploration of visual art narratives in folk art and a milestone in the South Asian scholarship. Professor Chatterjee is also famous as a very accessible teacher, a generous supervisor, and an amicable person on the whole. Her lectures on the issue of phenomenology, semiotics, and contemporary theories have riveted her students and colleagues. So it's our privilege to have her with us today, and it would indeed be a treat to listen to her. To chair the event, we have with us Professor Ankur Datta, who has an uncanny and versatile research interest with a range of motives such as art, culture, violence, conflict, history, and memory. And the discussant for the event is Professor Devnath Patel, who is deeply involved with research areas like folklore studies, popular media, gender studies, and disability studies. May I now request Professor Ankur Datta to chair the event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Athana, for a very warm, generous introduction. I won't spend too much time saying anything much. I mean, Athana's mentioned most of the important things. But Professor Roma Chatterjee has been a sociologist for a very long time, has taught for a very long time, and has also had very wide research interests. While I'm aware, your work, the work you began with looked at folklore. My first introduction to your work was actually your work on violence, which she had authored with Professor Deepak Mehta, also at the Delhi School of Economics. It's an excellent book, Living with Violence, and I definitely, from students I teach in violence suffering, you should check out that work. But we're very pleased to have her here today. And also her book, Speaking with Pictures, Folk Art and Narrative Tradition in India, is here. It looks very interesting from what I've seen. I look forward to also reading it, and very critically, it is in the library as well. So you guys can all definitely go in and take a look. And I encourage you to do it very strongly, and also check out her other work on violence, which I can say personally has been very interesting. I'd also met her actually a few years ago when I was a PhD student visiting the Delhi School of Economics, and Professor Chatterjee was assigned my supervisor for a period of 10 weeks, and a lot of feedback and comments helped me shape practically 2 chapters of my own thesis. So without further ado, they're all yours for the next 45 minutes.
Thank you, Ankur. I must say it's a privilege being here with friends like Sasanka, and they, all of whom I have known in other clubs through the years. I'm very happy to be here. Now, what I'm going to do really is to talk about the way a particular story develops pictorially. Now, I think I could just begin by very briefly telling you why this is important for a sociologist to do. I would say that the folk arts have not really been studied by people other than ethnologists, but clearly art historians don't. But I think just to lay it down on the table, the approach, I am a sociologist, I have always worked with the ethnographic method. So I think what my interest here was to treat as my field site the images themselves. Obviously, I did go and stay in particular places, villages and so on. A lot of my field work was also in sort of mixed media areas like exhibitions, workshops, the village of course. etc., etc. But I think how we are different from, say, other people who also look at the fine arts would be that firstly, I think for us, the object is not a given. We, in a sense, have to constitute it in the field. Remember, when everyday life becomes the ground from which you develop, institutions aren't given. You learn to recognize them through repetition and through the unfolding of relationships. So if I was to use the same kind of approach, and if my field site was the picture, it seems slightly contradictory because unlike social relationships, these are material objects. So what is it that I'm looking at? The first thing that I think that I began by doing was actually I teach symbolism, so how do you recognize a symbol? Only by how often it's repeated. So you know something is significant when it's repeated. Now, so actually one of my early introductions, and this is actually in Delhi Heart, not in the village where I did my field work, was with this particular theme that I'm going to be talking about. Actually the 9/11 strike. Now, over time I discovered that there was also very interesting developments. See, so the more pictures you see, you begin to realize details and nuances. You know, for most people, it's enough to say, here you have this very quaint and exotic image of a plane with a bearded face, headed with a bearded face, sort of bashing into what looked like, columns. That's good enough, and people have remarked on the fact that here you have these quaint villagers who are also doing so there's an exoticization of the event. Now, my reason for actually picking up this particular narrative was to show that firstly, folk art, folklore in general, to critique that particular impression that many people still have, especially after the nationalist period and so on, with people like Kumaraswamy, or thinking about folklore of any kind, folk tradition as being timeless. So here you have people who more or less become like vessels, who are very respectful but who are carriers of the tradition through the generations, and we in India are very lucky because we still have these living traditions. Now the point that I want to make here, and I know because there are many people here who are very sensitive to this, is that anything to do with the folk, precisely because so much of it is not in the form of material culture, folk songs, dances, etc., tend to be contemporary. If it's a living tradition, it has to be contemporary. Now, so it can't be part of any timeless tradition. We don't know what it looked like earlier because nobody bothered to document it. They are supposed to be ahistorical, right? Which is why they're not supposed to change. The other way of looking at it is that you have something coming into the present which is a bit out of sync with the times. Barbara Kirshenbach-Gimlet has said that folklore, generally all folk cultural traditions are supposed to sort of bring other times. So they're heterodox because temporarily they involve a juxtaposition between a now and a sometime else. So the somewhere else becomes a sometime else because after all this is all in your own society. Now the point is, I think especially for sociologists, because we also work with the present, we are by and large not historical. And I think that's a big strength which we need to consider. How would one study the present? Firstly, far more difficult because it's in the making, isn't it? It's not crystallized. You can't go to this document or say, oh, the archive is already there. It's not. In fact, when the subalterns problematized the archive, they did it by taking from sociology and social anthropology, by taking their methods. So that's important. So I'm looking at folk art, folklore, folk tradition as an emergent. This is a term you must have come across in your own readings from Michael Fisher and other such people who've written on this. But already, if you're thinking of something, say, how would you study the SARS virus? It comes, it goes. You may track its current, you may track where it spreads to. But somewhere along the line, there is something that suddenly appears. It's like what Durkheim called a social current, right? This disappears. How do you recognize it as a social fact? That's the first question. Now, the other point, one is that it was interesting for me to think, if I was to think about folk traditions as being emergent, what is it that I need to focus on? So I focus on something like this, which is really using a particular kind of narrative language, a narrative discourse, and a particular kind of art tradition, and it is an art tradition, to be able to interpret an event that occurs somewhere else. These were the issues that I was concerned with in my choice of subject for analysis, for further interpretation. Now very quickly to tell you something about the community, this is actually more like a social formation. It's hard to talk about the Chitrakar, which is their name. The Chitrakar would be the making of pictures. Now the designation is not very old. In fact, if you even look at, if you go to Rizvi, Castes and Tribes of Bengal, the word Chitrakar does not apply to these people. The word used is Podua, Jadov Podua, Tek Pote, Vaidya, etc., many terms. So already you realize that you're in the presence of a fairly complex formation somewhere along the line. But what's interesting is that over time, the term Chitrakar becomes a term of self-designation. So even if, and there are some signed pots. Pot comes from the Sanskrit word pat, which just means cloth, right? Because these are paper stores packed with cloth, they call pot. In Bengali, pat becomes pot. So I'm going to use the word. Increasingly, these are being called Patichitra, but it's a kind of Sanskritization. Those were the words used for the Odisha painters, who were definitely painted only on religious themes. It was a ritual art that was used as part of ritual ceremony, and they had a higher status. They were called Shilpis. These people were called performers, right? Now, I think part of the look, so Potua is a term of denigration, which is why a lot of people from this community don't like to use the term, especially the people that I have worked with from the district of West Medinipur. There are neighboring districts of Birbhum, Bankura, where Potua seems to be acceptable. Now, so again you see that sometimes from village to village, there are variations that become socially very significant. What does happen is that sometimes as late as the late 30s and early 40s, just around independence, there is a huge movement towards mobility. Now you have, these are by and large Muslims. Again, what does it mean to be a Hindu or Muslim? Till very recently in rural Bengal, in much of rural India. Remember? Because if you took ritual practice, then you would always find interesting amalgams of different kinds of deities. Now, people have used the word syncretism to refer to this. Increasingly, that's a term that's come under a lot of criticism, because it's assumed here you have these two religions which are independent and then they come together. It doesn't work that way. But people like Tony Stewart, etc. have said that maybe we can think about efforts at translation. So in everyday life, when you have people, and especially to these two religions, Islam and Hinduism in rural Bengal, these are the two big religions, right? So in the interactions, and you would have had villages where you have mixed populations, like the village where I'm working, very large Muslim community, not most of them are not painters. These are fairly low in the village hierarchy, or were. Now things are changing with peace and prosperity. But what you do find is there would have been an interaction, also attempts to translate. So use the word translation to say that, and you could have deities that developed, like Satyapit, Satyanarayan, that show manifestations. They are embodiments of this effort to translate your practices into someone else. And remember, it's important to do if you have interaction on a day-to-day basis. You don't have homogeneity in most cultures. You work with the idea of pluralism, especially in India, but I would say everywhere. It's the vantage point that you take. Now, so if these people were Muslims, what is interesting are Muslims, and of course they have a history of choosing different religions. So there are these constant swings between Hinduism and Islam. Now, I don't even know whether this makes any sense, because maybe there was no Islam in Hinduism at some point. You had many different peers, you had many different gods and goddesses, and depending on what the history of your family was or your personal choice, you would have had one or the other Ishta Devata. Very often, deities like Satyapit and Manasa, the snake goddess, demand worship. They may force you to worship them regardless. You might be an atheist, but they come to you so persistently. So it's as if there's an everydayness and a wakefulness to this particular dimension of ritual, religion, call it what you will, spirituality, which may seem very exotic to us, but it is a living presence, right? Now, so you have a community that calls itself Muslim right now and has been for a long time, though there have been waves of conversion. One important swing was in around 1935, where there was an association that was trying to encourage Sanskritization, a term that you're familiar with from Srinivas, where many Chitrukars were being encouraged to converge to Hinduism as a way of improving your caste status. After all, the name Chitrukar does not sound very Muslim. Also, if you look at the origin myths, there are myths which talk about a curse, and this interesting curse and damnation I have heard from many different service castes, artisanal castes that deal with craft occupations, who on the one hand are creators and therefore obviously descendants of Vishwakarma, pretty high in the pantheon in the Hindu cosmology, and yet who in terms of social status are very good, sometimes even former ex-untouchable. Many of them would be on the schedule. This group is actually a OBC group in West Bengal because they're Muslims. If they would be Hindus, I'm sure they would be scheduled caste, right? So, okay, so you have this anomaly about Muslims, by and large with clientele who are Hindu. Most of their compositions are also about gods and goddesses that are popularly known as Hindu. Now, where does this Osama bin Laden plot, this 9/11 plot fit in? Let me quickly go over the story. आप है अच्छा पहला slide दिखाइए. What I'm going to do is very briefly. Now, this is a tradition where you display a scroll. Now, a scroll is rolled up like this, right? हाँ, पहला वाला number 1 पे जाइए, उसको enhance कीजिए. Click. बड़ा नहीं कर सकते हैं.
But if you select all and
ठीक है, I'm talking till then. So you know it's a rolled up scroll like this, and you open it slowly, one frame at a time, keeping the others closed. The singer is also the person displaying it because these scrolls aren't huge, right? So you need only one person, and you point to that frame and you sing. Very often the first frame is invocatory. So for instance, if you're singing about the snake goddess, you will first obviously praise her. You will describe her attributes, that she sits on a bed of snakes, her ornaments are made of snakes, etc., etc. So very often the first register is pretty big and it more or less sets the scene. Ashur Jamano is the word used in the performance tradition of Bengal, that you set the stage for what is to come. You awaken anticipation. Now what's interesting is that unlike, we would typically be associated, think about words and images, relationship would be of picture books, right? Where the picture becomes a kind of illustration. Here this is not what happens. Now I have heard at least 6 songs sung to this particular scroll. So clearly, as if there is a way in which the pictures are telling you something, the song is also telling you something. The relationship between the two is not a one-on-one relationship. There is no direct translation between one and the other. Now, this actually looks very simple, but it's a pretty sophisticated scroll. It's fairly narrow. It's not very long. It's only about 2 feet in diameter. So she will have space to put in 2 towers. See, so there you have one of the towers. Now what's interesting, you know that this is really just symbolic. It's not realistic. Remember, the plane doesn't even, it's not even hitting the tower. Attention is directed away. So this is just laying down what the subject is. So now you know this is about the 9/11 strike. Next pe jayenge. Please keep an eye on the position of that column. This frame, this is just 6 frames. It shows you, again, remember that column now becomes a divider between Osama bin Laden with the beard and his group and Bush on the other side. Now, notice that they're on the telephone to each other. So already what you have is a very interesting way of showing a relationship. Already you know in the Indian tradition, well, equally in the Islamic tradition, think of Habil, Qabil, Cain and Abel. It's a way of articulating a relationship of intimacy in difference. Right? Hindus, Muslims, if you're talking about really historical groups, it could be Kauravas and Pandavas, it could be Cain and Abel, Habil and Qabil. And again you have, I'm sure you have them in Bangladesh as well, phrases that are pretty old, poetic which talk about Habil Pare Shastra, Qabil Quran. Habil reads the Shastras, Qabil the Quran. And you know it's Cain and Abel. Adam Mata, two Shantan. Adam Mata, the first primordial mother, has two sons. One reads the Shastras, the other the Quran. So already you can see that there is an interface. But remember, intimacy is also the place which is fraught, because that is where enmity arises, and enmity that is irresolvable. You're not going to be fighting that much with strangers far away, are you? It's precisely because you are brothers that the potential for hostility arises, because of your similarity. Not just, you are not alien. So here, actually Bush picks up the phone and tells, what did you do, my brother? He phones Osama and said, what did you do, my brother? What happened? And Osama said, what had to be has happened. Right? So here, the same column has become a sign both relating the two, but also of difference. Remember telephone, now the electrical connection, the telephone cable is something that Alpana Kaur uses all the time to show connections. If you see any of her paintings, then I suggest you do. So it doesn't seem so far-fetched that Satni had the idea. She's not showing the cables here, but look at that column in between, third picture. Now the same column now has become a canon. Now again and again notice, remember this picture is linear, it's a linear story that's been told sequentially. So if one frame is visible, the others are hidden. So as I move, I keep rolling up from the bottom. So, because this is a sequential story, like with films, remember the sound is a little bit from the side. So you know that it has to connect with the next image. Here it's the tower, the column that is connecting. So the tower transmutes into that barrier to intimacy that you saw in the last picture. Here it becomes the cannon. This is the wall, the Afghan war. But remember, the cannon isn't facing the other side. It's dividing the two and it's facing upwards, telling you something that has already gone on. So each time, part of the story is retained in your mind through the image. Either the audio image, auditory image, the song has gone by, or the visual image, which is again, it's in your mind. Part of Indian aesthetic tradition here. That first you begin with the virtual, memory traces. These memory traces could be from past lives. We are talking about theories of incarnation which both Muslims and Hindus have, whatever that may mean, in rural India. Next, please. Okay, now further pictures. Now, what is interesting is that many of these images, now look at that spread eagle image in the middle, which someone who's clearly read, also evokes images from the Jishu pot, the Jishu Mongol pot, which is about Jesus Christ. Again, it's a fairly new composition, not more than 15 years old. But again, each one of these images harks back to another set of images from somewhere else in their narrative universe. So again and again, anyone who's familiar with this universe, both of painting as well as singing and storytelling, each one of these figures can evoke something else. So it's as if ideas themselves are being connected, not through exposition, but through evocation. So there's a very subtle evocation of maybe a whole. And this is a universe. So a universe isn't available to you altogether. But each story assumes a relationship of simultaneity that simultaneously lots of other stories are available. So nobody, for instance, in South Asia would hear any of the epics for the first time, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, many of the stories about thieves. It would be assuming, it is assumed that you know the story. We don't have to focus on the plot. We don't have to show how it unfolds. We will focus on something else. These indirect connections are definitely on us, on emotion. So the performer decides and the painter what combination of rasa that they want to show. Very often, if you're talking about a particular episode in the Ramayana, when you want to focus on the rude comic aspect, you pick up on Ravan always, because Ravan is a comic figure in the folk tradition. So you take up a combination of the heroic and the comic, or you might want to take up a combination of the wondrous and the pathetic, which is what's being done here. The song begins, "A Ajob Ghatana," or you say that that a building with 32 stories fell. How sad or how tragic. Here, another song would say, "Oh, what a wondrous event." Bush went, but he could not find Bin Laden. Okay, next please. This is the last. No, there's one more after this, where you see Bin Laden moving in, disappearing into the Tora Bora mountains, right? Now again you see the way, in a very sophisticated way, just by using lines that seem to replicate and reflect his headgear, the idea of multitude sort of going in, vanishing, is being shown. She's quite a sophisticated artist. Next please. So this is the last. It's as if they're summing up the story. Very often the first register and the last register are in a relationship of symmetry, inverse symmetry in a way. Now this is it comes from a particular kind of storytelling tradition. So if you notice, if you actually look at the composition of the Mahabharata, much of this inverse relationship is available in the way the text is composed, right? So where different stories, because remember the Mahabharata is composed of many sub-stories which frame it. So each time Yudhishthir said, "Oh, is anyone so unfortunate as me?" Somebody tells him the story of Raja Nal or some such thing. Now, so there's people like Hill Python who worked on the composition, not just on the content, talk about this idea of reverse symmetry, which is there anyway. I mean, folklorists like Rema have worked on this and so on. So it's a way of carving out a boundary. So it's as if I'm carving out something from a larger universe. Now, one thing with myths, because they refer to a storytelling universe, they never begin, they never end. So there's a very self-conscious way of picking up this. I'm selecting this, which means boundaries are being redrawn again and again. Unlike fairy tales, where once you said once there was or once upon a time, the rest follows. You know there will be a journey and you know he will have to come back with the magical tree or the princess or whatever. This doesn't happen here. Because in some way all the characters are there in abeyance. Depends on where you want to throw the torchlight. So where your torchlight falls, which figure it hits on, story will develop around it. How, you don't exactly know. Okay, next please. So this is the story. Now what I've done is, I was fortunate enough to be able to, why I picked on this, because actually this story was composed about 5 years before I started doing field work, right? So it was pretty fresh. I could actually follow the process of creation. The impetus was not some outside NRI patron who said, wouldn't it be nice if you could make me one like this? And then people, if this is the way, people very condescendingly talk about the way newness often enters into this folk tradition. That someone gives an idea, it develops, people realize it has market value, this is commodification and therefore degradation of a tradition, right? Now here what happened was that pretty much soon after 9/11, there was a folk theatre troupe that came to the village. The village is about 4 or 5 hours if you take a bus from Calcutta by road, 3 hours if you take a car. The road isn't great, right? So you do have traveling troupes, theatre troupes that come from various cities in Bengal, Bihar as well, right? Now, so over here you have this Jatra troupe that comes from Calcutta and they perform. Of course, the Jatra was not on 9/11 per se, it was on the geopolitics of that region and it ended with the strike. So they were far more interested in US-Iraq relationships and relationships of the Middle East. Now, Monu Chitrakoot, I think Frank Coram was visiting Noida at that point. He had been sent, I think, to commission works for the museum in New Mexico. So again, you know, this is an important methodological point. We as researchers always intervene in our field. And this is a very good example of it. This place has become a researcher's village. Frank Coron was visiting, he was spending the night in Noya, in the village where I also did my fieldwork in a school teacher's house. So they all went off to see this. I think he'd come to meet Guru Podo, another famous artist who had some connection with the Smithsonian. So he'd gone to meet him. And this is a fairly accessible village. It's interesting why so many people go here purely accidentally, because it has a very new community of folk artists, not more than 50 years old. You have much more famous villages, nobody goes there. So there are all kinds of interesting contingent reasons why things happen, right? So anyway, so that night they started chatting about the play. And Monu got the idea through, because see, Bengali villages are very politically aware. Actually, all Indian villages are, right? So they, and it was, you know, the left front was still very much there, right? So they got chatting about these things, and Monu immediately started composing a scroll. Now his scroll more or less follows the way information and news started trickling in. This is before they got rich enough to afford television. Electricity, remember, is still fairly uncertain in these places, even though the electricity often load shedding for more than 15 hours a day, even now, and they didn't have TVs. Radio is not something that most people listen to, I mean individually, you can listen to it in a group, but clearly they do get newspapers. Gaurashokti, of course, which is the communist newspaper, you have these big places where they display it for free. There's a left front Shakha right there, CPA. So news clearly was coming in. Now he more or less followed. So here notice no bearded face. This is a regular plane crashing into towers. Now I'm not showing this spot because of the lack of time. Another 15 minutes, right? Okay. So he tried to weave it. Now he did not follow the storyline, plot line of the Jatra. He wove in a sort of local interest story about a young Monhar, where, you know, which is a very, anyone who watches Bengali television and films will recognize this story about this, you know, a very able boy from a lower middle class family, not rich, gets a scholarship, goes to study in America, works, gets a job in the World Trade Center. He's coming home to get engaged to his sweetheart, you know, in some local colony in Pada in Calcutta. Now, of course, he's in the World Trade Center and he dies, right? The night before he's leaving, the day before he's leaving for India. Now, what's interesting, and of course, you know, Monu shows scenes of relief and recovery. You have the firemen and so on and so forth, and he also weaves in this local interest plot. Now what happens is, the story that I showed you before is actually a later one, done by his niece actually. They also are fairly endogamous. So you have both cross and parallel cousin marriage between first cousins, a lot. So that niece of his is a much later plot. I showed that because that's the story that stabilized over time. So over time, next please. Okay, now, in his story, it was very clear that agency wasn't actually easily attributed to anyone. Remember, nobody knew for a long time. Osama hadn't actually acknowledged. He hadn't taken claim for this big victory. Now, Monu is extremely sophisticated. He only showed scenes that show signs of revelry. So Osama celebrating, you know, with these gun salutes and things you could see somewhere in the deserts of Afghanistan and so on. So there was as if there's a suggestion of an inference that, you know, celebration on the one hand, lack of loss of breeze, which allow you to attribute agency. But remember, he is not actually signposting any bearded plane or anything. So it's still open-ended. Who is responsible? So therefore, who are the main protagonists of this story? Was unclear. So clearly you could see there's a bit of confusion, because remember, these stories are told, narrated and displayed not 10-15 minutes short. It's not like a jatra that can go on the whole night, or a part that can go on for many nights. Where you already know the story so you can follow it. Here you don't. So it's as if already you did know. Was this, well, this very, you know, good boy from humble family, was he the hero? Is Osama bin Laden the hero? Who's the hero? Ultimately the story becomes about the relationship between Bush and Bin Laden. That's the archetypal story. Cain, Abel, Kauravs, Pandavas, Ram, Ravan, etc. Next, please. Now, his sister, Shorno, she is visually probably the most intelligent artist I have met. She is the first one to put the face on the plate. So suddenly, already by now, you can see that there's a way in which images circulate. Now, obviously, in any oral tradition, and I'm using the word orality just to refer to the lack of authorship. So somewhere along, there is an acknowledgement, obviously, but it's not important. So nothing is fake. An artist doesn't have to sign the work and say it's mine. Like you can recognize a Hussain painting. Anyone who knows these artists know who's done what. But there is a circulation and a borrowing of motives. If something works, somebody else will pick it up. Now she's the first one to put a face on the plate. Now typically by then already you can see an event. And this is a very event-based narrative tradition. Whether you take from myth or from some historical event, it will be around earthquakes, floods, the tsunami, or around Sita Haran, the abduction of Sita, or the killing of Ravan, or the building of that bridge to Lanka, so on and so forth, right? It will be around an event. But the way the event is addressed, it could be a historical event like this, would be in a way that we all learn from Indian pathetic, you generalize it. So it's as if now that event can speak to all times and all places. In a sense, it's being decontextualized. So over time, we see from Monu's pot, the second, that red thing that I showed you of Osama celebrating, 2 images from his pot, which is the first pot on this theme. You find over time that the story has become a myth, right? How is it become a myth? Precisely because the particularity of context is not important anymore. Rather, it's speaking on a different register. It's speaking about something else. Bush and Bin Laden could equally have been Cain and Abel. There's an archetypal relationship being built up. So myths are true, they are also unreal. So myths aren't lies. They are true because they're telling you something about something which you have to deduce by going below the historical specificity of these kinds of events, right? So there's something archetypal, there is generalization going on over here. Sadharanikaran is the word that's used, that you get from poetics, right? Okay, next please. And analogy, now of course, Shorno tends to put faces on lots of things, right? So she even anthropomorphized the fire engine, that's the fire engine. That didn't work. So people were very happy to accept the face on the plane, but the fire engine face wasn't particularly acceptable. So again and again, see, it's not as if there's no creativity of an individual kind happening. Each time a story is told, say from the Ramayana, you put in a little bit extra. Everyone experiments, right? But the point is, certain things remain, are effective, they get taken up by people and they circulate. Other things die out. They are not as effective. So what I'm trying to show in this is how a particular story gets crystallized over time. So how an event becomes a narrativizable story, myth. Okay? It does so by being locatable now. It has to find a space and a voice in this mythic tradition. I'm trying to show what is the process in which is occurred. But how does that relationship of antagonism and intimacy develop? That's basically what I tried to do in this. Next, please. So, okay, again, different scenes from, this is again from Shorno's. Next, please. Now remember, so again, anyone who studies symbolism knows how do you recognize a symbol. Often it takes years. Because this could be a symbol of something, how do I know? Some meaning has to get attached to it. Now, till now, we've seen that maybe attaching a face to that play, where we still don't know whether, and some people have a big problem. They say, it seems as if now agency is being attributed to Osama, but actually Shorno wasn't doing that. All she was saying, this is a story about Bin Laden. She wasn't saying Bin Laden is the reason why this happened. So it's as if like one of those mythic pots which say, okay, this is a story about the snake goddess Manasa, or this is the story about Ram's exile. So I have to signpost it. So that was a way of signposting a story. Over time, what's happened, on the one hand, you saw with Togo's pot, a particular relationship through that telephone conversation and the way in which the tower motive is positioned, a particular relationship is being signposted. Now that already takes on a mythic dimension. Here what you find within the scroll itself, there's a very interesting reverse symmetry that develops between the demonic and the, say, divine. So here what you find, already this is Osama disappearing into the Tora Bora caves. The mouth of the cave has already become an inset. Look at it. You can see there's a border around the mouth. Now the inset. In all religious imagery in South Asia particularly, I know, I've seen enough, is a way of actually showing this. It's actually a way of relating different times. It could be a historic. So for instance, if you go to a shrine, very often you will find, and you can buy a little picture. Say you go to Narasimha Pet, which is just outside Hyderabad, you will find a huge picture of image of Narasimha presiding over the local bus stop, pilgrims coming up. So you have a very interesting combination of historical time, a present, and mythic time, Narasimha. How are the two related? By showing them in little decorative boxes, surrounded by a flower border or some decorative border. Here what you have already, now remember the song isn't doing anything like this. It basically talks about scenes of horror, scenes of wonder, scenes of pathos and tragedy. But the picture is telling you a totally different story. A story that doesn't get taken up in any of the songs. It's showing you this very interesting juxtaposition between Osama as demon and Osama as Pir. Just by the way in which, so remember the first register is gone, but there's a resonance in your mind. It's a big, it's about this big, right? Stays in your mind. This one is also huge. And there's an interesting juxtaposition of this kind of reversal. Where you think, okay, could you show me the next piece? It will become even clearer. Now the fact that this is an event that is available, see, global events are mediatized, always. A lot of people have written on the 9/11 strike that your first relationship to it is through a photograph, right? Or an image of some kind. And it's really a proliferation of images is how we tend to think about global events. They're always mediatized. Already you can see, by drawing on other ways of telling the story of 9/11, there's an interesting awareness that this is one mode of storytelling amongst others. News, television news, live TV may be another way of presenting the story. Using a very different kind of storytelling genre, tradition. So already you can see there's a very self-conscious awareness built into the picture itself of saying, I am telling you a story with a moral message, but remember, I also heard the story from somewhere else. Maybe there's someone else telling a story which sounds different. That's on television over there. Next, please. Okay, now what becomes very interesting over time in this particular story is the way they play with the image of the first and the last registers, frames of the story. So it's as if they become the boundary markers. Inside the story follows historical time. Then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. But the first two registers sort of located on some mythic register. Because those two are not the ones that have any kind of empirical index. They don't, okay, fine. You know what, then I won't, very quickly, can you give me 7 minutes?
Yeah, sure.
See, then because I want to show. Now basically, so very interesting things happen. Now the first registers become fixed with that face, bearded face. The last register develops in interesting ways. Over time, and I don't have the time to show them here, you find that it's really become the mazar of a pir, a tomb of a pir, like you could have Nizamuddin Dargah, or those little local dargahs which you find dotted all over Delhi, you know, a roadside, covered with a green cloth. You could clearly see he is enshrined in that mouth of the Tora Bora caves. On top of him, you have a tree growing out. You know, you show boulders, tree growing out, people praying. Clearly, it's become something else. The song doesn't do anything. Here, what this artist has shown is actually playing with this idea. Remember, for a long time, nobody knew whether Osama was alive or dead, right? You kept seeing his image though, video. They kept releasing them and you kept watching them through Al Jazeera or wherever. So this whole idea of, is he alive, is he dead, is he an illusion, is he reality? You have multiple images of Osama, literally referring to that notion of spectral presence. Now what was interesting, and actually that's why I just want to go on a little bit further, if you don't mind.
No.
Okay, so the thing is that somewhere along the line, when Osama was actually discovered and killed, that's where the story dies. It's interesting that nothing much happened. So at the most you'll attach another little frame to say, okay, and you see a sort of body, sort of, bloodshot body lying on the ground. But it's not as if the story develops. It can't. This was a perfect end for a myth. Because in a myth, the end is deferred. Remember, ends don't begin or end. Myths don't begin or end. It's as if the questions, you're saying, oh, now the question is going to be taken up in a following story. Why did Draupadi have 5 husbands? I will tell you one more story to tell you. Each story ends with another question. So it sort of reveals a network of other stories. Some of which you may know, others you won't, but it's assumed this story is part of that network. And you know what that network is somewhere. Now, okay, so somewhere it's as if, see, once history overtook the event, which is now a mythic event, lost its impetus. It lost that creative charge. You stopped seeing big scrolls. You only started seeing little, pictures you could frame up and put on your wall with a plane and a face. Could be any old plane and a face. The story stopped developing. Now, I was fortunate enough, part of my fieldwork was multi-sided, so I in fact was able to take some artists with me to this delightful publishing house in Chennai called Tara, which is doing wonderful things with children's books, so-called, actually not children's books, and they work a lot with folk artists. They've been working with gold artists, but they were very interested in exploring. There's been a graphic novel boom in India for some years now, in seeing what they could do to develop with our own art styles, and we all assume folk arts are our own art styles. Whatever, unlike Amar Chitra Katha and all the criticism that has been going through, that we are developing our own. So could quickly, ab jaldi se dikha dijiye. So what was interesting was that there was this graphic novel experiment. Now none of these images led to books. But the 3 artists that came with me, they knew 2 others from their workshops in Chennai. All thanks to all our Dilli Heart kind of activities. We must thank the government for all of this. Now, Arijit Sen, who's one of our early graphic novelists in India, right? He is a brilliant teacher. He showed them some of his own work. They had a talk. After all, this is also a form that tells stories by relating words with pictures, images. So then they started experimenting on their own. 3 people took up the abduction of Sita's story. Montu, you haven't seen his work in this. He's the one who's done this cover. It's the first scene of the Gujarat riots, and he plays with reverse symmetry a lot. This is a straight depiction of the first register. The Photoshop walas haven't done anything at the publishing house. They had the work done for them already. What he did was he decided to take the Bin Laden story. Now the problem was, and which is why I need to do this quickly, is that, see, graphic novel is a different way of telling stories. In that other tradition, the story, it is assumed you know the story, you only play on the emotion. Now over time, as these scrolls have become commodities and they're selling on their own without the performance, they've developed a storyline, right? Earlier pictures didn't have, you just needed one picture and you could sing many songs from it. You just needed to show a snake goddess and you could tell the whole of the Manasa Mangal from it. That's it, right? It was like a tableau. Now the pictures have started telling stories. How much of it audiences understand is not our problem, but they're telling very sophisticated stories now. Now, here the problem was, you have to assume that the story isn't true. So you have to first build in the context for the story, and you have to develop a plot. So you actually have to tell a story. You can't take it for granted. The plot has to be told. Secondly, you need a protagonist. We were told that a comic book, none of this avant-garde stuff here, you need to have a protagonist. A character around which the events, the actions will develop, because graphic novels break up events into action, bits, micro sequences of action. So they have to be elongated. And you can show them from different pictures, because each little box separated by the gutter on a page, say there's 6, maybe 10. So it has to be fairly detailed, like a cinema. It's organized in the same way. Now, he decided, after some thinking and discussion with, he decided that his protagonist would be a fragment of the damaged plane. Not Osama bin Laden. He's too big a protagonist. We don't know enough. Because also, we don't know enough about him. What story can we tell about him? And where do you locate it? Now in myth we know there's Kishkinda, Dandaka, there's some Panchavati, we know these contexts. So he decided that where would a damaged plane be that was in a position to tell the story of its life? In a museum, obviously. In a 9/11 museum. Now see, it also gave him an opportunity to put in some of the images he liked best. So remember, very often storytelling for any author often begins with a phrase, not with a plot. Here, because he's a picture storyteller, it begins with things he likes to draw. So Krishna Leela, you find that little cow on top, you find peacocks, you find tigers, elephants. Beautiful things are in museums, right? So he's drawn beautiful things in vitrines out there. Now, after this was over, they did a little bit of Photoshop, but basically, I translated the story, what he wanted to tell, and someone helped by putting in words, because most people here are not literate. He is, but only in Bangla. So, okay, the story is, one side was a happy plane carrying friendly things. Now, of course, Montu had put a beard on his plane. Now, because they don't deal with the before and after kind of story, that it has to begin, it has to end. They had to be able to show a beginning and an end, so that's the only change that was made. Panels is what Montu worked with as well. He said, look, the writing should come in the middle. So what they did, they just removed the beard. Next, please. Okay, so now this is the friendly passenger plane flying in a happy, peaceful way. And and I was, well, whatever, it basically says that here I was minding my own business and flying off here and there, but then, next please. Okay, now Montu, what he picked up really well from the lectures in the morning, and remember this is just after one lecture, so just think about what kind of visual mastery, see, because this is an entirely alien genre. Just the level of intelligence is phenomenal. He knew that he had to break up an action sequence. In the pop tradition, you encapsulate. You know, you could have the whole of the Mahabharata presented in one little register, just by indexing it in a very iconic kind of way. Here he had to actually break up a very small action sequence, a plane coming towards the towers, so that he could build up the anticipation. Remember, a comic book has to deal with multiple panels, so it has to break it up. So he showed the plane coming closer and closer. Next please. And this is what they work with as well. You show different perspectives, sometimes the tower, sometimes the plane. Now, again, look, I don't know, can you see? You can still see that the plane is someone, there is a complexity of agency. Is he an agent? He was hijacked. Sorry, I'm saying he because it's an anthropomorphic representation. So it's as if against his will, the plane has been forced to do something shown so beautifully by the teardrops falling from the corner of his eye. Right? So here a dramatic device, the first scene of the Bin Laden register, has also acquired a human face. Next please. Already you can see the beard growing, the evil side is showing. Again, that tension between the divine and the demonic, and there different scenes, this a little bit of Photoshop was applied and they reassembled it, where you show both signs of the chaos, the fragmentation body parts, and also that whole idea of the inset. Usually in this tradition, even an inset involves a whole figure, not a part of a figure. So there you see part of his face, something evil was inside me that day. So I'm going to stop here. So all I want to end with is saying somewhere along the line, the completion of an event led to actually the loss of creativity. It's as if as long as Osama's presence was problematic, we didn't know whether he was alive or dead, there was still the possibility of storytelling or of creativity. Because stories always deal in the what if mode, don't they? Suppose, or that something happened in a parallel universe. Comic books play with it all the time, don't they? And in fact, I read a lot on comic books by writers of comic books like Grant Morrison. And in fact, they've said that Marvel Comics, they build up a separate universe of comic book characters, right? Where there's a whole world. After 9/11, they didn't know what to do. So they had a special issue where you have all these Marvel heroes, you know, all these Green Arrow and whatever, Fantastic Four and stuff, coming, standing at ground zero and weeping. Because actually when New York needed them the most, they weren't there. They could do nothing. Even Dr. Doom, who has destroyed the universe many times round, he's Osama bin Laden 1,000 times over. Even he was weeping. Because after he destroys the universe, it always comes back. It bounces back in the next issue, but it wasn't happening here. So there was a sense in which already, you know, when the real world had become fantastical, comic books had become real. So again, it's as if, so when the event is no longer capable of being carried by a particular mythic tradition, you need a new mythic tradition in which to carry it forward, and I will say that here you have it. By maybe moving to another genre, another mode of storytelling, you can maybe take up a dimension that has become close to you now. And it's precisely because I think myths, and I would say this is part of any living storytelling tradition, work in the subjunctive mode. They set up this relationship of suppose, what if this could happen. So it's as if there's a relation of parallelism, side shadowing. I'm talking about this, but also suggesting that maybe in a world that maybe doesn't exist but could exist, something else might happen. So typically this is where I will stop. I'm really sorry, I've taken a lot of time.
This was a
Okay.
pleasure. I'm glad you
Okay. I will stop here. I wanted to close this.
Thank you. That was I was absolutely fascinated. I think it was also just introducing me, well, for me at least, I'd say it's like introducing me to a new way of looking at these images. I mean, we're used to seeing, say, pots as like symbols of tradition, and you pick it up and you actually see them kind of like the way Jamini writes paintings are, you know, adorned on a wall, but to see them as part of a kind of story, a part of a narrative. At one level, you're sort of decontextualizing them, and at the same time, you realize, and it would have been actually fascinating to see an actual pot being unfurled by itself, but just to see that how that encapsulates story, but also the complexity of how it relates from story, image, and about the connections going all the way of politics to this very type of presenting. That was really fascinating, and I hope Dr. Bartok to as Bruce discuss it.
Yeah. Thank you. It was beautiful, and I'm still under the awe of it. I will just flag out some of the issues which seemed to me very important and probably to generate discussion a little more on it. So it looks like, first of all, the most important is this whole suggestion of doing ethnography with visual objects, and it's like a way forward in the practice of ethnography, and which may also help us, a lot of us, to explore some of those issues which have been considered like something beyond the pale of ethnography. So that is something extremely inspiring here. And in addition to that, however, I was wondering if it is not to be called syncretism, when we are looking at the social formation of Chitrakars, this group of Chitrakar. If it is not syncretism, and of course there is problem with the term syncretism, and it is efforts of translation, how to distinguish this effort of translation from the liberal notion of syncretism, which is by and large now part of our common sense. I mean, whenever we talk of this kind of social formation, we generally tend to think through this category of syncretism. So all of us who look at, some of the students look at Sufi Qawwali, so they would read, they would be predisposed to read the syncretic value of Sufi Qawwali. So how to make that distinction, I was wondering. Secondly, a very important part was this, continuous process of myth making, and it reminds of this idea that politics would be mythology in the modern world. So here, in the process of myth making, something extremely interesting happens. It refers to this paradox that on one hand you have authorship of some of those myth makers. They are adding motives. They have this creative liberty, and they are capturing motives from the circulation, and they are adding faces to objects, and so there is a recognition of authorship. On the other hand, there is also anonymity of authorship, because the motives are coming from the circulation from all kinds of sources. So I was wondering how to, if it is possible to deliberate upon this interesting paradox. And also to another level of paradox in the myth making process is that it is on one hand very contemporary. So this myth is very contemporary. Whatever folksy we find about it, it's very contemporary. On the other hand, it also perpetuates certain archetype. I was wondering if that too can be a little bit more. Also, if this archetype is exactly in the same manner in which Carl Jung talks of archetype, something to do with our unconscious, collective unconscious. And lastly, the whole idea of ethnography, I mean, this is fascinating, and this is very, very promising for us. I personally feel extremely encouraged, and many of the students who would be willing to do researches in the area of art and culture, they would probably take ideas from here. But ethnography, as it is generally put in very axiomatic form, is intertextual hybridity. It allows intertextual hybridity. Right? And here, when we are doing multi-sided ethnography, of course, it is more hybrid than ever before. How to put this whole practice in the scene of writing culture debate, the inscription of culture. I mean, what kind of inscription is happening here? Because many of us do grapple with these questions in the light of contemporary situation. Yeah. So this is what I meant.
Should I respond?
I think we can respond to Dave, and then we'll open up.
Thank you, Dave. That's extremely thoughtful. Okay, now, yeah, shall I begin with syncretism and translation? How I see them. I have used the idea of translation very centrally. Of course, that famous essay by Benjamin, where I think the idea that translation extends the reach of a language by taking the other into it. So in fact, a work only lives through translation, isn't it? So there's a sense in which circulation or moving to new contexts does extend the reach of the work itself, but also language per se. Jakobson had said, he was a famous linguist and also symbolist, Russian, who had said that actually what is interesting, because he also worked a lot with poetry, is that you can always get across what you need to get across. But that's why he worked a lot with poetry, because it's the materiality of sound or hear picture. That's what is hard to get across. Now, supposing, I mean, he gives lovely examples. This one example where there was this poem on death that was being translated from Russian into German, that involved also a change in gender, where death became masculine from being feminine. Now remember, it may not matter in a statement of fact, but in a poem it matters. The gender of a term matters. It's not neutral gender here. It would affect the whole poem. So clearly, was this a new poem or was it a translation of something? So the point is not to assume that you, see now the problem with syncretism is you assume that there are fuzzy areas on the fringes where people follow heterodox tradition, but the center, the core is stable, right? So a lot of people wouldn't accept the Sufis, or when you don't know how to classify something, you call it Sufi, isn't it? Syncretic. So I think why people like Tony Stewart have problems with it, frankly, it doesn't matter to me either way. But it's precisely because of this. Now, if you assume translation is at the heart of any language, and certainly for me it is as a sociologist, that I teach semiotics. So the point is, even to get across what you're trying to say to the next person, it involves an act of translation. So it's somewhere you meet in the middle. Meaning is generated in the middle somewhere, when one sign is being translated into another sign. After all, you just don't have an utterance. It also has to be received. Something has already changed over there. So if that is your very definition of the sign, translation has to be built into it. So I would go with Pearson to say that you don't have a sign without its interpretant. An interpretant is just another sign which becomes a substitute for the first one. This is where then I take up the idea of the generality. You know, the problem with Jung's archetypes is they become very hard to use for a sociologist. Remember, for us the context is crucial. We collect our own data. Basically our interpretations are built into certain contexts of where we were, how we did it. That's our methodology. Those kinds of universal archetypes I find very hard to work with, though I read a lot of Jung, especially his students like Erich Neumann, whose I work on the Mother Goddess. It's because, you know, they work like art historians work. A lot of the interpretation is in the head of the analyst. Now obviously a lot of this, I put this story together, but the fact is, I can always demonstrate how I did it. By going, that is why the ethnography is so important, because I can tell you how I came across it, what was the context. I can build up the story. Now you tell me whether you think the story is plausible or not. Now for me, somewhere along the line, those stories sound less plausible. Maybe I'm not a psychologist. But see, for me, this conversation across, these meanings are not hidden as far as I'm concerned, because the myth is revealed to me. I know the universal myth. I've worked on storytelling for more than 30 years now. I know this region. I know the kinds of stories. So I can put things together. I can also relate other social institutions like kinship and religion and so on. Now, somewhere along the line, so when I use the word archetype, I'm referring to a particular universal myth. Now, if I was to compare it or take some other, Cain and Abel I can do, because remember, they are Muslims. So the Quranic stories are as much available as part of the living tradition over here. And we know that there is a huge oral tradition all over the subcontinent about these. I wasn't aware of it because I had worked with Muslim groups before. But I've become aware of it in the last 6 or 7 years. I've read a lot around. And then if you go back to medieval Bengal, for instance, the way Fatima Bibi is incorporated. So many other figures are incorporated all over India. As in sort of juxtaposition and as counterpoints to other goddesses. Like even the snake goddess, there's a Hassan Hussain Pala and the Manasa Mangal. Where does it come from? Clearly there's a long tradition of association. Now, are we talking about fuzzy things happening in the fringes where you have these two perfect, complete religions? No. If I build it, which is why I like the word translation, already you assume a difference. Even if everyone was a Hindu belonging to exactly the same caste group, let's assume they're all monolithic, they're all sort of, there isn't a kind of pantheistic universe over here. You would still have to translate across what is this goddess to me and what she is for you. That would still involve a change. Now, this change might actually lead to occasions of these kinds and be very creative. So you don't know in advance what something means. You only know it once it's communicated, which means it's already changed. This obviously, a lot of semiotics comes from linguistic theory and from the theory of ritual sacrifice as well, where these things, something is coming into being, meaning is being generated through the act. Language is an act, symbolism is an act, all these are acts. They're not there. The materiality is still resolving into social relations. No? We are sociologists here. It's not given over there. We don't know what it is. But in the circulation, through this communication, it becomes something else. And I think that process is something we have the tools to study. Because we don't study them as given. Relationships are not known in advance. I can only constitute them, which is why the presence of the ethnographer is part of the process of constitution. The new one would have looked different if anybody else had studied them. And after all, to even present them in that way, he removed the whole of recent history, which was the history of colonization in Sudan. Everyone studies the new one, right? Evans Pritchard's right. So he constructed them in a particular way to highlight the point about stateless societies. There were no stateless societies, they were part of the British Empire at that point. Because he wanted to say something intellectual. That can you have politics and political and power without a state? That was his question, wasn't it? Well, so we need to think. Now, it is in that way. And I think this idea comes definitely from Indian poetics, which I've been reading Abhinav Gupta for this and Ananda Bharkar. My Hindi is not so good and Sanskrit non-existent, so I can't say very much as yet. Very little is available in translation into English. So the way they use the idea of generalization is precisely to allow something to get enhanced, to estrange it firstly. So by removing something from one context, you also estrange it, you alienate it, thereby you allow it to expand in a way that certain things, like that's how metaphors are used, right? Certain things become clear, are highlighted precisely because now they're not part of that familiar context anymore. So they could equally have stuck with, the way Munu represented the play. In his genre, that would be called realism. But it's only when you start putting a face on the plane, which just is really for dramatic effect. Now remember the peer image at the bottom develops much later. It develops after that first phase, not before. Till then you are happy, for a long time you just show him going into the caves and vanishing, but then what happens? So it's as if again and again, by decontextualizing something, after all we decontextualize as well, and ethnography is after all an artificial construct, isn't it? It's like a kind of story writing, coming to your writing cultures point, that it is only through the self-consciousness, selection of a particular mode of writing, the genre. So I could do it by using statistics, I would be saying something. So the way you choose to represent something is part of the method of research, isn't it? The fact that you do fieldwork in a particular way is already determined by what the end product is going to look like, even before you knew. And in ethnography, remember the analysis comes after the data collection, so you don't really know what theories you're going to use. Unlike, supposing it will be economists or statisticians, it would be the research design that would belong us. That would determine what data are collected. Ours, we start the interpretation after, but already we know we're going to write monographs, big or small, whatever. So, in a way, I think, yes, my inscription as someone who's going to write theory, if I wasn't already someone who spent years and years working on storytelling, I would never have approached this. I mean, there have been monographs written on this community without a word mentioned about what they do. But perfectly possible and legitimate in our subject. In fact, sociologists never look at art. But if you were, how would you look at it? Like an art historian or a folklorist? No, I have to find another way. Right? And I would say our one contribution would be by showing the making of something, by showing its unfinished quality, because we work on the present. Isn't it? The present is only bounded by the future and the past. in itself, it has fuzzy boundaries. So I guess I should stop there and open it up. Oh, authorship, sorry, it's important. See, now the thing is, again, I worked on orality for a long time. See, and it's again, for most folklorists or other people who work on orality, they record songs. Or they record stories they come away. They already know this is an epic, this is this kind of song, this is that. I saw this actually on the ground when I was doing my fieldwork for my PhD. I lived in a village for 2 years. So I could only collect stories through everyday interactions. I couldn't actually tell people sing for me. That wasn't the method I was trained to follow. So what happened as a result, I actually saw things being made. And I could also actually see genres being shaped and changed. So again and again, in many parts of India, you have things that women do, women's songs, marriage songs, men do. Now, this sounds fine on paper, but actually if you live in a place, you see men singing women's songs all the time and women singing men's songs. Why aren't these recognized? Because remember, orality, as long as something is being sung and reproduced, it's alive, otherwise it dies. So again and again, I was in the presence of experiments that would not have outlived the life of the composer. Now, if I was working like a folklorist, I would never have come across that. It's because I was working as an anthropologist, those became important for me to ask, why is she doing this? She will never be able to sing this song in public. At the ritual occasions when women do sing in this village, they only sang on certain occasions. This woman was singing a jhumur which only men sing, because women's voices are never heard in isolation. That marks you out as a courtesan. She wasn't one. She couldn't do it. So why did she compose this song? It will die with her. See, now that's an interesting question for us as sociologists. It tells you something about social structure, about the anomalies of gender roles. Folklorists, for them it was a given genre. So see, orality, it's not as if creativity is always individual, but what are the ones that stay on? They acquire a life because the collectivity, the more it's repeated, the more it changes, the more it stabilizes. There is no such thing as purely individual creativity either, because everyone borrows from somewhere else. Only here, the perspective is on novelty. There, the perspective is on continuity. But without novelty, nothing survives, nothing circulates. So it's more a methodological issue. Am I looking for change or am I looking for continuity? Both are crucial. I'll stop here. Sorry, I'm speaking very long.
Okay, so we'll now open it up to questions. Shall we take 2 questions?
Anything.
Okay, so we'll take 2 questions. We've got the first 2. If you can just introduce who you are and
Mine are really curiosity questions.
Just
I'm Dia, but they are curiosity questions. I'm curious about the fact that in the pictures at first you showed first.
That was all part of one stroke.
Okay, and this comic, because here we have a plane which is having a moral conscience, I mean having a moral issue, right? And there we have Osama as becoming a peer, and I'm wondering what is in this difference between these two things. I also had a question about the picture you showed with the column and there are 2 sides to it.
Yeah.
One side,
Register
yeah.
first.
One side is all women, one side is all men. Okay, I'm curious about that. And finally, this is just an off, but there is a Pakistani political satire which is a Bush calling Musharraf on the phone. And this image that you showed, it really made me think of this. And I was wondering if you could say something about that. Thanks.
Ma'am, my name is Umesh Joshi and I'm a student of sociology first year in South Asian University. I basically have 2 questions if Ankur sir would allow me to ask, they're short but precise. Yeah. The first question is, ma'am, what impact, how do you think that globalization has impacted this folklore? Because on the one side you are saying that it has, the commodification has, caused the degradation of tradition.
I was criticized by that position.
And the second side says that this is what was the impact of globalization. So how would you look at it? And the second is, ma'am, do these people consciously take up stories that are mythical? Because one side you showed us a book cover that is on the Gujarat Heights, you don't really know who attacked the car sevaks, who was involved, who was the leader. And
Not riots, earthquake.
okay, that is about the earthquake. Okay, so and the second one is Osama bin Laden. You don't really know is he alive, is he dead. So do they consciously take up these stories which are mythical?
I'll begin with you. Okay, now the very first, that's an interesting question. See, already we're dealing with two very different narrative forms. Now, in the first case, characters have no interior life. In folk tales, characters are events or they are actions. Roles are complexes of action. So a prince is a prince because he behaves like a prince. At the end, very often a prince looks like a villain at the beginning of the story and he only reveals as a prince because of what he does and what he's able to achieve. In this case, see, that was the difficult part. The protagonist had to have an inner life. So you can see the creativity of someone and the intelligence by which, and remember, he still has to only depict something that is a sequence of events. The story has to be a sequence of events. How does his inner life show through the sequence of events? Remember, he doesn't have to do it. In the first case, the beard is a symbol which is pointing to something else.
So it's not a reversal in its own way.
Well, it's a translation. It's a translation, isn't it? So when you move to another way of telling that, the symbol adds something. So the image of that story, if you take it as a symbol, something has been added to it from another language, another narrative. So that's a very interesting question. The second, now, do you ever go to these Durga Puja things? Ever looked at the war god Kartikeya, who rides a peacock? Clearly see the model here. Somewhere I think late 19th century, early 20th century in Bengal, the war god became the dandy and he was a model. So you could see, so what you're calling the woman is actually the dandy. Now obviously there are very interesting connections with the Kali Ghat way of representing 19th century dandies. It's like that. So all Bush's men are shown as dandies. Little bit of, see, this is CPM ruled 32 years West Bengal. Little bit of decadence, Kali Yuga type imagery there, without necessarily denigrating it in any way. Get it? So all of Sama's men were bearded and experienced and old. Bush's were these youngster dandy types who were learning on the job. See, not women.
It's true actually, the
Fact. See, now, see, these may be unreal but true, right? Myth. Okay, the third one was
the Pakistani.
Oh yeah, see, it's fascinating because clearly there is a lot. See these images and this takes me to your globalization. Do we really know what we're doing when we're doing it? We don't. See, something develops, it acquires a momentum and it's amazing.
There's a Pakistani satire which is basically every night Bush calls Musharraf. Musharraf is usually in bed, so it's this whole thing of the telephone.
Yeah, the telephone. But see, clearly then these symbols, these images acquire a life of their own. So are they the agents? And this is we're taking us back to symbolic theory. So they have a life through the circulation between different people. So no one can actually say, I created this, you didn't. Maybe it was done through you. So a little bit about that, here are these unconscious vessels apply to all creative. To all of us, because we all speak and stuff, don't we? Even if you don't write, you speak. So in a sense it develops a life through the fact that it's moving from my mouth to your ear to your mouth, etc. Right? So the circulation develops a kind of accelerative force. Okay. Then there was, I think these were the basic questions that you had, which were very interesting. Coming to globalization. Have you read Appadurai's book, The Social Life of Things, as yet? Have a look, very interesting. Only because I think you develop some methodological way of addressing globalization. What is globalization associated with circulation, isn't it? So if the object circulates, money is the best example. Actually, long before Appadurai, Torquat Parsons you're studying. Look at generalized media exchange, what are they? Trust circulates, money circulates, power circulates, values circulate. Right? Now, clearly if you look at an object now, not through its being embedded in a context, but in its ability to create new context, what else is circulation? Now what's happened over here, so the point is not to say pretty things about globalization. We are not opinion makers here, we are studying phenomena. How would you study globalization? As someone who's doing an empirical study, you look at the way an object travels, isn't it? Which is precisely what I've done. I've looked at the way an object travels, so I've gone from the object back to the relationship. Now in the process, the object is developing. So, and Mani Shekhar Singh, whom you also met, has worked on this. This whole idea is that what happens when, say, this art form, see, already the performance has been detached from the painting. Once that happens, the painting develops a life of its own. It begins to take on the burden of storytelling. So over time, I can see this from the evidence that I have. There's a lot more context built into the story. Early stories only showed a tableau. See, if you see a chariot with two figures and then when one is blue with a peacock feather, you know what's being referred to. Don't need to know anymore. You don't need to see other soldiers lined up. You know. Here, increasingly, they're putting in much more detail. So already this is but because it's acquired the burden of storytelling, where do your storytelling models come from? From a particular aesthetic tradition. So I feel folk traditions, I'm talking about India here, very sophisticated, because remember, we've had generations of thinking about these things, and thinking is a collective process. So they may, I mean, where do you think all these people got their ideas from? By doing field work, right? People like Patanjali, Panini, Abhinav Gupta, they didn't invent these theories. They must have studied these, they must have been good sociologists in their own right at some level. They collected data. So somewhere along the line, I mean, okay, let's not be mysterious over here or indological. Somewhere along the line, if I read semiotics, if I read some of the Indian linguists whom I've been trained to read, these pictures make sense to me in a way that they wouldn't otherwise. You know, just by looking at the way they're composed. They literally composed using certain ideas. Now, globalization is interesting precisely because it allows us to say something, to study circulation. Now, circulation assumes decontextualization, that something happens when it moves to different contexts. Does it also do something to those contexts? Yes. Does it also change in the process? Right? So that's precisely what I'm interested in studying. I thought this was a good example because clearly I would not have been able to say anything about the story if I'd only looked at one scroll. It's by following a story over 7 years. This story over 7 years, and I have seen more than 100 scrolls just on this subject. I wouldn't have bothered if I wasn't trained in this particular way. It's only then that I feel I can see something happening over here, a story taking shape, right? Entering part and becoming part of a collective tradition, which is now defined by its circulation. It's no longer part of a local community. Now, that's one part. The other part is the way in which globalization is addressed again and again in certain subjects is through the mediation of something else, whether the radio or the television. It's already as if pointing to something about the nature of the image, isn't it? That it is decontextualized. Radio, you hear something that comes from far away. TV, you see something that comes from far away. None of these actually, their cable operators don't show them local events. Only far away events. Right? So I could see that there's also a very self-conscious pointing to the global nature of that event. So it usually happens with things like the tsunami, 9/11, a choice of subject you said. Again, I think, remember, if you think with the image first. Any good, if you're a storyteller, this could be an acoustic image or it could be a visual image. So clearly when something presents itself to you, this would be true for any artist. You already begin to think about it in a particular way, using the tools that you have. We would use the tools that we have. Wouldn't we? Now, I would say selection is dependent very much on the narrative form in which you compose, isn't it? So certain things allow you to do certain things. I would say that even if this had a certain impact, remember the Cain-Abel relationship didn't build with the first scroll. There it was just a spectacular dramatic event. Over time, the Cain-Abel motive suggested itself. Clearly there was something that allowed this story to move in that direction. It hasn't happened with the tsunami or the Gujarat riots. But typically the tsunami hasn't developed in well, it has, but it's developed along a different line. Not around this. So I would say somewhere along the line, I don't know how much, there is obviously intentionality, but I think we need to expand the scope of intentionality. In sociology, it's always a relationship. And remember, any action, you read Weber, right? The action is in the interpretation of the action, the meaning of the action. When I perform a gesture, I don't know if it's an act or if it's just an impulse. It becomes an act only when it is interpreted in a certain way. We should apply the same. I would say if we go from the sociology of action to this, it's actually very useful to understand. So then we are not caught up in this, whose idea was it? See, which is a false question, frankly, isn't it? Because ideas only develop in interaction. They can't exist without it. So any sociology of action, if you read Mead, if you read Weber, they say precisely this. There's always a conversation of gestures. So any idea is only an idea in its transmission. Becomes an idea. Otherwise, it's not an idea. Right? I think that's it.
And shall we take another question? Shall we take three?
Yeah. So as many as you like, and you will remind me if I missed any. So, okay.
Well, okay, let's go ahead.
Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm Aditi, and I'm an MA Sociology second year in this university. Actually, carrying forward from what Umesh had asked, I am just curious in. I'm trying to link certain strands in that particular area. When we talk about globalization and folk art, now taking examples from this, now since you said that there is these trolls, now the storytelling is not in the storytelling in the sense of performance is not there now.
It is there.
But very not really in the limelight.
No, they still need the story to compose. So they first compose the song, then compose the painting, even though the two are detached.
Yeah, now they are actually detached, and when we talk about it, take it in the larger picture, in the globalized world, what is really presented, these two things are totally detached. So performance is not really what is presented with it. So aren't we, in that sense, aren't we losing the basic roots of it in the wake of globalization? Because what really the folk performance is, what really the folk art is, ultimately we are actually losing it in the wake of globalization. And now in the world we live in, where again globalization is very important, now this may be subject to misinterpretation because there is a difference of cultures.
Take that up. Very important question, but you clearly didn't understand a word of what I said. But it's an important question because lots of people think like you. Okay, I get your question.
Yeah, because
but I'm sorry, I don't think you understood. I was clearly not clear at all in what I said, but I will explain it again.
Okay, because I'm still not very clear about it. Therefore, I posed the question.
Once again.
So so therefore it's like that's what I was a bit confused with.
I get your question. Right.
Ma'am, my question is actually the opposite of the question.
Here, why don't you take this?
My question is actually opposite to this one because I remember we are in a theory class doing about this culture industry and the impact of globalization. and art losing its roots and everything. But my question is, I hope I've got it right, I'm not sure from your talk, that, isn't it that, okay, we can say that in today's time, art must have, it has not lost its essence, but has taken a new form. And can we say that rather than criticizing that, okay, the industry has led to the loss of the essence of art, it has led further to new transformations and new processes and new meanings being developing from a particular art, because of which art has now been kind of immortalized. For example, if we attend Ramayana theatres and all, where the original of Ramayana is now translated
What
into
is
modern.
the original epic? It was produced historically, right? What's the original? And which period are you taking as original?
I mean, I'm taking what we have read in school in books. So, in gym. And now it has been translated into different ways. And this is how the art is still, there among us. It has not lost. So my question is, isn't it wrong to criticize industry and globalization as something that is leading to the loss of essence of art, rather than saying that no, it is somehow leading to a positive effect? So this is my question.
Yeah, take some.
Take one last question.
So, any question? Sure. You've heard all this before.
I would like to know.
Sure.
While we are interpreting these art forms as an ethnographer, should the freedom of expression of the artist be our concern?
I'll begin with that because it's the shortest. Obviously, we are sociologists. What else are we here doing? What else do we do, right? Tell me, when you go out and do field work, what will you do? That's all you will be doing, isn't it? But that's our primary concern, our sole
when
concern.
I'm open to multiple interpretations, how do we...
Again, I think somewhere along the way, you studied sociology for how long now?
3 years.
Okay, can you just tell me, what did Weber say about how do you define, how is action different from instinct? You remember? Or a gesture? Tell me. Anyone remembers? When does an act become a social act? Let's begin with
associated with the others.
What is a meaningful act, a socially meaningful act? When someone else says it is, isn't it? Someone to whom that act is directed.
Yeah.
Now the meaning I can't give it. Who is the artist here? In this case. The one who made the gesture, but if I didn't even know I had made a gesture, I don't even know I've made a gesture till someone else responds to it. That's when I realized I'd made a meaningful gesture. Why is this so different? See, I tell you what your problem is. You've grown up with a particular stereotype, it's a powerful one, but clearly you're not thinking like a sociologist here. Okay, any folk art form. Point is, it has to be contemporary, right? Otherwise it will be in a museum. Okay, now one problem is, why should anything survive? Clearly over time, lots of things have died, dinosaurs have died, dodos have died. See, the world does change. In that not everything survives. Now certain things do, certain things don't. History is made up of contingency, isn't it? There is no reason why something should survive, so there is no reason why we should mourn it. That's not what we are in the business of. We study the present. Now, to say that this leads to a degradation, what did you say? Globalization. I want you to now think empirically. Give me an example then. You could be very right, but these are sweeping statements. Do they actually mean anything? And are they useful? You could be right, I don't know. The point is to take up particular cases and see what happens, isn't it? So rather than make sweeping statements, we are not political scientists, we are studying something empirical. Take up a phenomenon, show me how it changes. You could be right, It may be awful. Now, I know a lot of what I was seeing when I was doing my PhD, I thought was ghastly. But then I realized that because I had already been influenced by a very romantic idea of what it meant to be a tribal. Following in the tradition of Rousseau to Ritwik Ghotto, clearly romantic, clearly a construct. And a construct which was so bad that took nobody's voice into account, except the filmmakers in that case. Over time, once you live there, once you start seeing it as a process, that surely, I mean, it's growing every day, who is to decide whether it's good or bad? Now, obviously, there are important issues when you're looking at an artwork. You have to, in some way, if you don't like, you must either hate it or like it. If you're neutral to it, it's unlikely you'll study it anyway. This is true for everything. Now, the point is, what do I do with that initial impulse? Try and understand why I think it's a degradation, why I think it's a loss. Now, I know why Kumaraswamy thought so. He was a man of refined sensibility. Also, he felt the British period empire itself led to vulgarity. Now, other people have gone in and looked at it and said that no, if people are engaging with that kind of invasion creatively, how can I say it's vulgar? Clearly, if people are engaging with it, if meaning is being modified and reconstituted and something new is coming about, who decides? Why should my voice have power over other people? So for me, it's more important to see what is the process by which it is happening. Now, it could be that people don't want to dance or paint and stuff and it dies out. People are perfectly free. I mean, why on earth should you hold on to something for the heck of it? Why should you? Now, I would say clearly because there are certain things that can be responsive to new tastes. Those are the things that do circulate. Others may not. But clearly there are also contingent factors like, government agency using particular art forms to propagate other kinds of messages regardless of aesthetic value and so on. So there could be lots of contingent reasons why something gets picked up for circulation and others don't. But rather than making sweeping statements, see, because my whole object of my talk was to problematize this very idea that folk traditions are eternal and their only response to change would be loss. That's a huge problem, isn't it? I mean, and it is so supremely arrogant, isn't it? Isn't it? That you have clearly no resources by which to cope with change, to cope with the real world. I mean, isn't that rather ridiculous? Something is called folk only when it is in relationship to something that is not folk. Folk traditions were called little traditions in relationship to a great tradition. Now, those are not terms we use anymore. But the folk, any kind of peasant group, have only been what they are because they have an interface with something they are not. A feudal society, kings, today increasingly a state government, etc. Now, that relationship means that they've always been conscious of something that they are not. They've never lived in an enclosed world. That's the difference you make between tribe and peasant, isn't it? The folk are typically peasant societies, isn't it? And in India, of course, most Adivasi groups have also had this very long interface. Now, obviously, the two have learned from each other, haven't they? Already, if you go back to very early texts in Sanskrit, you will find voices which are non-Vedic, non-epic, non-Aryan, and so on, used deliberately all the time. So clearly, both the high as well as the not so high relate to each other and recognize the other in very important intellectual ways. In India, certainly this has always happened. See, your kind of ideas built up from conceptions of folklore which had to be salvaged from things that had broken down. I mean, basically this was Finland, right? Where Kalevala, a lot of their epics had to be reconstituted by folklorists because they no longer existed. So part of national sovereignty was to find your folk traditions. Again, we've never had that problem. So ours, maybe we have an abundance of riches, or maybe because the folk things are still contemporary. See, I would say that the salvage mode is a political statement. It's like when you feel you need to create a culture to prove that you're a nation. They go with the construction of nation states, nothing else. In your case, it's the same, a reverse of that. Again, see, it doesn't make sense to make sweeping statements. You have to take particular examples. In that, if something is around and people are listening to it, as a sociologist, it's your duty to look at it carefully. Because clearly something is responsive. In your case, okay, now many of these paintings, clearly people don't understand the story. But clearly it strikes a chord. Now, if we assume that meaning isn't fixed, that meaning is generated and added to in the process of interaction, which is why the graphic novel experiment is important for me. Remember, someone's putting in the English words. So obviously the story is being constituted through dialogue and interaction, isn't it? So meaning can never be the sole property of any one mind. It's a contradiction in term. It always involves an active translation. That was what my talk was about, basically. Using these two, so precisely by moving, and that is why I took extra time moving from one way of telling the story to another way of telling the story. Something is added to the event itself, isn't it?
Yeah, true. I mean, it's like the very point was what I was also trying to make was that not. I agree with the fact that really.
See, you first have to empirically ground your statement.
Because the thing is, I agree that for an art form to survive, it has to undergo.
We don't know. Why should an art form survive? So many have died through the year. Why should it survive?
Those who have had to undergo certain, kind of changes in a bit. But what I was
No, see, sorry. Let's stop right here. There is no such thing as an art form that can be identified as unchanging. Every time something is done again, it has changed. Even if you copy something you think with great fidelity, it has still changed. Why do we call it a copy?
But the whole point of it was if it's not misinterpreted in the sense.
What is a misinterpretation?
For instance, if I take it as an art, take music as an art form. If I, as Dev said, I also give an example of Sufi Qawwali. Now, it has also undergone changes over time, significant changes over time in everything. Now, what happens today that it's disseminated amongst the masses very significantly. All of us.
As it was in its first avatar, exactly. Remember, it was a popular form.
Exactly. Now, but how many? Now, it's very going to the very layman's view.
As it did then also.
How many of us do we really associate with it and understand that's what Sufi Qawwali in reality is?
What is it in reality? It's everything that you understand it to be, isn't it? Remember, meaning is generated by the person who responds to it. That's what meaning means. See, why don't you go back and read some of your theory? Meaning isn't something that pre-exists. Meaning is generated through that process of communication. Now, clearly in this case, it's only when this circulates that it acquires a particular form. Now, obviously, then people were responding to it in particular ways for it to acquire this form, isn't it? It had no meaning in advance. Yeah, wind up.
So, we'll end it here. This is a good discussion.
A bit more theory teaching here.
So, we need to end it. There's one, I think, more question. Yours? No, your question.
No, I started with
you
the
started,
last question.
so last.
Easiest question.
Okay. I see. Okay, so thank you very much, and for a very interesting and fascinating session. The discussion also ended up also being really fascinating to me. We'll continue with the discussion over tea and samosas outside.